The fluorescent lights of the train carriage flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz that matched the pounding in Alara's head. A college student exhausted by a week of relentless exams, she had boarded the late-night metro expecting a mundane commute home. However, as the train rattled through the dark tunnels of the city, the familiar landscape began to dissolve into something unrecognizable. The train slowed to a crawl, the brakes screeching with a metallic agony that echoed through the empty car. When the doors hissed open, Alara stepped onto a platform that felt fundamentally wrong. It was a station she had never seen before, silent, cold, and devoid of the usual urban hum. There were no exit signs, no maps, and no other passengers on the platform. The air tasted of ancient dust and ozone. As she wandered the desolate platform, she encountered two other girls who seemed just as disoriented as she was, Kaylee and Rhea. They too were students who had found themselves trapped in this liminal space. Together, the three of them began to explore the station, hoping to find a way back to the world they knew. Their investigation led them to a grim discovery near the station's edge. A collection of shattered, grotesque dolls that appeared to be watching them with painted, cracked eyes. "This isn't just a wrong stop," Kaylee whispered, her voice trembling. "We've crossed into somewhere else." They decided to follow the tracks, hoping they would lead to the next station, but the path was treacherous. They soon found themselves in a tunnel where the darkness seemed to have a weight of its own. It was here that the first true horror manifested. A low, rhythmic thumping, like a drum or a heavy footfall, began to echo behind them. When they turned, they saw a terrifying figure. A tall, pale entity that lacked a head, its body twitching with unnatural movements. Panicked, the three friends bolted through the darkness, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. In the chaos of their flight, they were separated from Rhea. Alara and Kaylee eventually burst out of the tunnel and found themselves on a desolate road that didn't seem to lead anywhere. The world here looked perfect in a way that was deeply unsettling. The colors were too sharp, and the silence was too heavy, much like the eerie perfection described in stories of the elevator game. Just as their hope began to fail, the headlights of a car pierced the gloom. A man named Silas stepped out, appearing at first glance to be a normal driver. He offered them a ride, claiming he could take them to a nearby hospital or a safer station. Relieved, Alara and Kaylee climbed into the vehicle. However, the relief was short-lived. As Silas drove, he began to mutter nonsensical phrases, his voice shifting from helpful to menacingly strange. "Don't worry," Silas would repeat, his eyes fixed straight ahead on a road that seemed to loop endlessly. "It's all right. You're exactly where you need to be." Alara noticed that the driver's movements were becoming increasingly erratic. He began to reach for her, his grip tightening on her arm even as he steered the car toward a dark, swirling mass in the distance. A portal that seemed to be the source of the dimension's strange energy. "We have to get out!" Alara screamed, realizing that Silas was not a savior, but a guardian of this nightmare realm. A desperate struggle ensued within the cramped confines of the car. Alara managed to fight off Silas's grasp and signaled for Kaylee to jump. They scrambled out of the moving vehicle as it approached the swirling gateway. The world around them began to fracture. Alara saw a shimmering rift, a way back to her own reality. She reached out for Kaylee's hand, But the shadows of the paranormal world were faster. As they neared the portal, a force from the darkness dragged Kaylee back. Despite Alara's desperate attempts to save her, Kaylee was pulled into the void. Alara felt herself being propelled forward, the sensation of falling through ice and fire simultaneously until everything went black. Alara woke up on a familiar bench in her own world. It was January 8th, 2018. She was back, but she was alone. The authorities launched an investigation into the disappearances of the other students, but their search turned up nothing. Alara's location history showed she had indeed been at a station, but it was one that technically did not exist on any official map. She spent months trying to explain what had happened, documenting her experiences in a blog to warn others about the elevator game and the hidden stations that exist between the layers of reality. She described the feeling of being in a world that looked perfect, but was actually a trap designed to consume those who wandered too far from the light. To this day, Alara remains haunted by the memory of Silas's nonsense whispers and the sight of Kaylee vanishing into the portal. She knows that while she escaped the paranormal world, a part of her remained behind on that silent midnight platform, forever waiting for a train that would never come. Marcus didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in caffeine, deadlines, and the 11:47 p.m. train back to campus. That was it. That was the whole list. He'd been at the library until security kicked him out. Finals week, the usual chaos. And now, he was standing in the cavernous hollow of Millbrook Central Station at 11:31 p.m. with a lukewarm coffee, a backpack full of highlighted notes, and 16 minutes to kill. The station was the kind of old that made architects feel things. Vaulted ceilings ribbed with iron, mosaic floors worn pale by 100 years of footsteps. The overhead lights buzzed at a frequency that made your teeth feel loose. At this hour, the place had maybe a dozen people scattered across its benches. A woman reading, 2 teenagers on their phones, an old man asleep with his chin on his chest. Marcus checked the departure board. Platform 4, 11 minutes. He wandered the way you do when you're tired and bored and just slightly too anxious to sit still. He drifted past the shuttered newsstand, past the men's room with its out-of-order sign duct-taped to the door, past a vending machine humming to itself in the dark. And then he saw the staircase. It was between 2 support columns near the far end of the station. A staircase going down with a small sign above it rendered in the same font as every other sign in the building. Platform 7. Marcus stopped. He pulled out his phone and opened the station map he'd screenshot months ago when he first moved here. He pinched and zoomed. Platform 1 through 6, clearly labeled. No Platform 7. He looked up at the real station map mounted on the wall nearby. The big laminated one with the color-coded lines. 6 platforms. That was it. 6. He looked back at the staircase. It's probably an old platform, he told himself. Decommissioned. They just forgot to take the sign down. That was a perfectly rational explanation. He was a rational person. He had 9 minutes. He went down. The staircase was longer than it should have been. Airports have that sometimes. Those corridors that seem to stretch as you walk them, like the building is quietly breathing in. This was like that. The overhead fluorescence grew sparser. The air got colder, not in a drafty way, but in a deep way, the way cold lives in stone that hasn't seen sun in decades. He counted 31 steps before he reached the bottom. Platform 7 was enormous, longer than any of the platforms upstairs, stretching off into darkness at both ends. The ceiling was lower here and damp. Marcus could see the sheen of moisture on the concrete. The floor was original tile, the old octagonal kind, black and white, many of them cracked. The train was already there. It sat on the track like it had been sitting there a very long time. An older model. He could tell even without knowing much about trains. The paint was a deep, dried blood burgundy. The windows were lit from inside faintly, with a yellowish glow that seemed less like electric light and more like something that had just not gone out yet. Marcus stood at the edge of the platform and looked through the nearest window. The car was full. Not packed, not rush hour full, but every few seats held someone. Men, women, a few older kids. They were dressed in the kind of clothes that made Marcus feel like he was looking at an old photograph. Collars and slacks, a woman in a belted coat, a teenager in a varsity jacket from a school he didn't recognize. None of them were looking at him. They were all looking straight ahead, toward the front of the train, with their hands folded in their laps, and their mouths were moving. All of them, at the same time. Marcus pressed closer to the glass. He couldn't hear it through the window, or he could barely. More of a feeling than a sound, a vibration that seemed to travel through the platform itself, through the soles of his shoes, up into his chest. He tried to read their lips. It took him a moment. They were all saying the same thing, over and over, in perfect unison, mouths moving in the same slow rhythm, words that were the same shape in every face. Don't stay after the last train. Don't stay after the last train. Don't stay after the last train. Marcus stepped back. His sneaker caught the gap between two tiles and he stumbled, caught himself, and then he was moving. Not running, just walking fast. The kind of walking that's trying not to be running and losing the argument. He hit the staircase, took the steps, 2 at a time. 31 steps, reached the top. The wall was smooth and solid. No door, no arch, no opening. Just the same dirty, cream-colored concrete that stretched from the support column to the men's room with its out-of-order sign. Marcus put both hands flat against it and pushed. Pressed his face close and looked for a seam, a hinge, anything, nothing. His breath came loud in his own ears. He turned around. The woman still reading. The teenagers still on their phones. The old man still asleep. Nobody watching him stand against a perfectly blank wall like a person coming apart. The departure board clicked. Platform C. Boarding. He walked to platform 4 on legs that didn't feel like his. He got on the train. He sat down. He rode home. He didn't sleep. In the morning, with pale sunlight coming through his dorm window and a half-eaten granola bar in his hand, Marcus opened his laptop and searched for Millbrook Central Station accident. The third result was a newspaper archive from the Millbrook Courier-Dispatch. Tragedy at Millbrook Central, 34. Dead in platform, 7 derailment. The date on the article was November 14, 2004. Exactly 20 years ago, almost to the week, a late-night commuter train had derailed on a lower platform. A platform that had been sealed off and decommissioned following the accident. Every passenger on board had died on impact. The train had been scheduled to depart at 11:47 p.m. Marcus stared at the screen for a long time. Then he scrolled down to the archived photograph. The train in the image was a deep, dried blood burgundy. He recognized the woman in the belted coat. Third row, hands folded, mouth open. He recognized the teenager in the varsity jacket. He scrolled back up, read the passenger manifest. 34 names, and at the very bottom, clearly a late edition, an anomaly. The article's author, noted with visible confusion, was a 35th entry, added by investigators, unexplained. An unidentified young man had reportedly been seen on Platform 7 before the derailment by a station worker. He was never found. He was never identified. The worker who saw him said the young man had been pressing his face against one of the train windows looking in. Marcus closed the laptop. Outside, the ordinary world continued. Buses ran, squirrels chased each other across the quad. His roommate snored. He never took the last train again. Daniel Marsh had a rule about trains. Don't trust them after midnight. He'd broken that rule exactly once. The night of his company's holiday party, which ran long and loud and left him catching the 12:48 back to Crestwood, ties loosened and shoes aching. He got on, found a seat, set a phone alarm for 40 minutes, and closed his eyes. The rule existed for a reason. He woke up to silence, not the ordinary quiet of a train in motion, the low mechanical hum, the rhythmic percussion of tracks, the ambient breathing of other passengers. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that exists after sound has been removed, the way a room feels when a refrigerator stops running and you only realize it was ever on, because now it's suddenly completely gone. Daniel lifted his head from the window. The train had stopped. He sat up, blinking. The car was empty. Not just quiet, actually empty. The family with the sleeping toddler who'd been across the aisle gone. The woman in the pea coat reading a paperback, gone. The college kid with the oversized headphones, gone. Every seat bare. The overhead lights dimmed to a sickly amber that made everything look like a photograph left in a drawer too long. Daniel looked out the window. A platform. Unfamiliar. He pressed his face close to the glass and tried to get his bearings, but the fog was extraordinary. Thick in a way he'd never seen outside of horror movies. Not wispy or atmospheric, but dense and physical, like wet concrete left a set. It rolled across the platform in slow, heavy waves. Somewhere beyond it, the vague shapes of a station building. A peaked roof, dark windows, a clock face with no hands. He checked his phone. No signal. Not one bar. Not emergency service, just that hollow icon and the X where the carrier name should be. And the time read 4:44 a.m. He stared at it, blinked, looked away, looked back. 4:44 a.m. The seconds weren't moving. "You've got to be kidding me," Daniel said to no one. He got up, grabbed his jacket, and walked to the doors. They opened with the usual hydraulic sigh, and the air that came in was cold in a way that went past temperature. It was the kind of cold that felt intentional, like the air itself had decided to communicate something. He stepped onto the platform. The fog closed around him immediately, not dramatically, just quietly, efficiently, the way a crowd fills a space. The platform was long and utterly empty. Old, he could tell even in the poor light. The benches had the curved iron scroll work of something built in another century. The overhead lamps were globes of yellowed glass on tall posts, and half of them were dark. The ones that still worked flickered in a slow, irregular pulse, like a heartbeat that couldn't quite find its rhythm. The station sign was there, a hanging rectangle of painted wood in the old style mounted between two posts. The paint had weathered away unevenly. He could make out two words, but they dissolved in the fog before he could read them fully. He stepped toward it. "You missed your stop." Daniel spun around. A man stood maybe 15 feet behind him. Station worker, or something that looked like one. He wore a uniform that matched no transit authority Daniel had ever seen. Dark navy jacket, brass buttons, a peaked cap that sat too low over his face. He was old. Deeply, specifically old. The way certain buildings are. Not just aged, but settled. Like he'd been here since the station was built and had simply remained when everything else left. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. "You missed your stop." The man's voice was calm and helpful. The tone of someone giving directions, but there was something wrong with the cadence. Like the words were being played from a recording, slightly out of sync with the mouth. "This is the last station?" "Where? What station is this?" The man tilted his head. "The last one." "That's not a name." Daniel's voice came out thinner than he intended. "What's the name of this station?" The man just looked at him. Not unkindly. The way you look at someone who is asked a question they already know the answer to if they'd only stop and think. Daniel turned back to the train. The doors were still open. He could see the amber light of the car from here, a warm rectangle in the fog. He needed to get back on and figure out where he was when signal returned. "The train doesn't stay long," the man said from behind him. Daniel walked faster. He got back on. The doors closed. He stood in the empty car and watched through the window as the platform began to move. No, the train was moving, he reminded himself. The train was moving, and the station worker stood exactly where Daniel had left him, watching the train depart with his hands folded behind his back, and that same expression of patient, opaque helpfulness. Then the fog swallowed him. Then the platform lights disappeared, one by one, as if someone was walking the length of the platform behind them, switching them off in sequence. Then there was nothing outside the window but darkness. The train ran in blackness for what felt like a long time. Then, gradually, the ambient suburban sprawl returned. The backs of houses, the orange sodium glow of street lights, the graffiti on a concrete overpass he recognized. His phone vibrated twice as signal returned. 4:44 a.m. became 1:23 a.m. and the seconds resumed their march. Daniel sat in the empty car for the remaining 11 minutes to Crestwood and did not move, and did not look at the windows, and did not think about the clock, with no hands. In the morning, with coffee and full daylight and the sensible solidity of his kitchen, he talked himself down. He'd been drunk, half asleep. The fog had been real fog. The station worker had been a real MTA employee. There were a dozen rational explanations for 100 irrational details, and he lined them up like witnesses. But the clock with no hands bothered him. You don't imagine a specific, strange detail like a clock with no hands. You imagine the dramatic things, the ghostly faces, the voices. The clock felt true. He opened his laptop and searched for train stations on the Crestwood line. Then he added, closed, then abandoned, then accident. The results came back and Daniel read them and then sat very still for a long time with his coffee going cold. Holloway Junction Station, closed 1987, following investigation into the Holloway Line disaster of November 14th, 1986, in which a commuter train failed to brake on approach and struck a stationary train at the platform. 41 passengers were killed. The station was decommissioned and sealed. The track was rerouted. No passenger service has run through the Holloway Junction site since the closure. He found a photograph in an archived local news article, black and white, dated 1985. One of those before shots, the station in its working days. A long platform, old benches with iron scrollwork, overhead globe lamps on tall posts, a station worker in a Navy uniform standing near the entrance, and above him the hanging wooden sign, Holloway Junction. He looked at it for a long time. His phone screen went dark from inactivity. He didn't unlock it. The thing that made it impossible to file away, the thing that lodged in his chest like a splinter and wouldn't shift, wasn't the fog or the frozen clock, or even the station that shouldn't exist. It was what the man had said. The last station. Not a station, no, the last station. As in, the final one. As in, the station at the end of all lines. The place where every route eventually, inevitably, terminates. Daniel had gotten back on the train. He thought about the empty seats. The car full of no one. 41 passengers who'd arrived at Holloway Junction 38 years ago and never been seen again. He thought about how easily he could have stayed on that platform. He thought about the doors and how they had still been open when he walked back. He thought about the station worker, watching him bored with that expression of patient, opaque helpfulness, and whether that expression had shifted in the last moment to where the fog took him into something else, something that looked just slightly like disappointment. Daniel poured the cold coffee down the sink, put on his coat, and walked to work in the long way around. The route that didn't pass the train station, the one that kept him on open streets where the morning light came in clean and hard and left no room for fog. He never took the last train again. He told himself that was a coincidence.